Mr. Shelton, what can the country take away from what happened in Ferguson and how it was handled?
Well, let's begin with how important our democratic values are in every little community across the country, even a community as small as Ferguson, Missouri. That indeed, without the continuous involvement, recognizing that democracy is not a spectator sport, it really requires for its success direct involvement for all. But if we look at what happened in Ferguson, a couple of things we should take away. One is that this is a township that had not evolved as its population has. Indeed, if we look at the population of Ferguson, it is a city that is 67% African American. Yet its police department, its city council, as well as its mayor's office is not reflective of that diversity. So as such, we know that if we look at what went wrong in Ferguson, of course, beginning with the tragic death of an 18-year-old and the inability of a police officer to communicate with an 18-year-old African-American unarmed kid. I mean, I have children as well. As I mentioned a little earlier, my oldest son is 19 years old, and I know what teenage African-American boys are like. And I know that like any other teenage kid, they require some discussion. They have their idiosyncrasies. They're teenagers. They're going through all kinds of changes. But they're unarmed, and being thoughtful about who they are and what they are is something that has to come with training of police officers as well. But that's not what we experience in Ferguson. So what we take away is the need to make sure that every level of our governance, including that leads to law enforcement, is done in a manner that's reflective of the communities they serve. Number two, there needs to be real clear policies about the use of deadly force or any kind of force on any children in our society, period. But we have a case there, somehow or another, the arguments are being made that an 18-year-old, because he's a little taller and a little bigger, than most other 18-year-olds, that somehow he's more threatening. And that is simply not true for someone without a gun or whatnot. But for some reason, again, the training in that police department, if we can go to that point, and certainly what that particular officer retained of any training was not inclusive of being able to deal successfully with an 18-year-old unarmed kid without having to take his life, and in such a barbaric manner, as a matter of fact. So we're going to have to talk about what our policing policies are. And secondly, we're going to have to talk about what the training is around those police policies. And thirdly, we're going to have some conversation about enforcement, holding police officers accountable for carrying out such an important responsibility. There's probably no more strategically important power that we provide to anyone in our society than we provide for those first responders, police officers. And as such, we have to make sure they're well trained, that they are very clear about what they need to do, that indeed they carry those services out, and that they're held accountable, because ultimately they are given the power to take life when necessary.
Right. You spoke about one side of the equation. What about the other side? When an incident happens, for whatever reason now, that can be a side, and afterwards people have things to say about it. And when it turns violent or people start looting, what should the people learn to do in situations like that?
Well, first, learn that is unacceptable. There's certainly, if we want to fix a problem, to be able to bring more damage and destruction and even the loss of life to a tragedy that's already occurred should be unacceptable for everyone. It should be very clear that we can't allow this incident to not be fully addressed. That we've got to talk about not only making sure that justice is served and those who commit crimes of erroneously or unnecessarily taking human life have to be punished in a manner that is appropriate for that scenario. But also we don't walk away from this thinking that it's just an isolated incident. There have been too many cases very similar to this across the country. Police departments are being trained in very much the same way. The policies are very similar, and they're held accountable to the same level. But as such, we know that that is not working. That very well, whether you look at Sean Bell, whose mother went to the funeral from New York after her unarmed son was shot to death by police officers outside of a strip club because his friends and relatives took him out for a classic American bachelor party. He's dead. We talk about Trayvon Martin down in Florida, where someone acting as if they were official law enforcement, community watch, mimicking all the characteristics as they understood of how law enforcement and police officers carry out their responsibilities, killed an unarmed 17-year-old with nothing more than Skittles and iced tea. We know his mother went to the funeral as well and all said the same thing: this shouldn't happen to us. I was just in Geneva, Switzerland with Trayvon Martin's mother, but also Jordan Davis's father. Jordan Davis was a young man who was with a few other African Americans outside of a convenience store. They were in the parking lot doing what teenagers do, playing loud music, and for some reason, for those of us whose hair is even close to gray, we don't understand, and for the most part, we don't even like the music they play. But nonetheless, some of us recognize they have the right to play that music as well, and that's what happened in that Jordan Davis case. The man felt that under the stand your ground policies, they were actually intended to extend in many ways the power of police officers to individual citizens, but decided to pull out his gun and shoot the kids as they were driving away, killing Jordan Davis and significantly injuring others that were in the car. For some reason, he thought that was acceptable. So we have a real problem. And what we shouldn't take away from this is that it can be allowed to continue to go on as it is. That with all these lives being lost and so many, you probably heard about the African-American woman whose car crashed into a tree late at night. She went and knocked on the door of a house asking for help. The man opened the door and without opening the screen, shot through the screen door because he was fearful of an African-American woman, but for no rational reason. There were no threats made or anything along those lines, but he felt that he could very well do that. There have been many other cases of law enforcement and individuals working within or acting within their capacity as individual citizens in the United States, but believing they can do this. But we have to walk away from this as knowing that that cannot continue. That if we allow this to go on the way it's been going on, it really is the clinical definition of insanity. Insanity being doing the same thing over and over again in the same manner, yet expecting a different result. That has not been the case. It was not the case after Amadou Diallo. It was not the case after Rodney King was beaten almost to death in California. It was not the case after the young man was shot in the back running out of an alley in Cleveland, Ohio, that led to a riot, and it certainly was not the case as look at what just happened with Michael Brown. That has to change, and that has to be where our energy goes. We have a democratic system that allows us to bring the pressure to bear of the American people. And the American people must organize themselves in a way to say that these are our children. And we cannot allow our police departments to act as some sort of occupying force rather than those that are paid by these same citizens to serve and protect.
You talked about occupying force. President Obama's suggestion that the culture of militarization has to change. Do you agree with that, and how do you think that can be done?
Well, first, I strongly agree with it. I mean, we've seen so many cases, not just of African Americans and people of color, but others in which SWAT or other paramilitary style extensions of police departments are sent in to address citizens' issues that have nothing to do with any need for paramilitarism. We had a mayor of a small town in Maryland just outside of D.C. where a sting operation was underway, but they went to the wrong house. They went to the mayor's house. SWAT broke in with all the ferocity, again, of a military tactical team, even shot the guy's dog to death and terrorized his family. We had many, many other cases where where SWAT was sent in or some SWAT type unit was sent in to deal with issues that really should be civilian policing issues. But because of a number of issues, because of the flow of resources to help law enforcement, as you know, we went through the big economic downturn economically for property. That meant that property taxes were reduced, resources were also reduced, and local communities were struggling trying to figure out what to do to keep law enforcement on the streets in time that they needed it most. Well, resources were coming in from the Department of Defense and Homeland Security and a few other places that allowed them to start buying military tactical hardware. the body vests, the armor, the helmets, the night vision goggles, things that are usually utilized for, again, military activities. But because of the void that was left from those resources from the local communities, these communities took everything they could, and this was available to them. But along with that came the training that goes along with having the paramilitary come in and be the ones to actually bring peace to a local community. It was a travesty. It was a huge mistake. What we saw on television looked more like Beirut or Afghanistan than it is the most highly industrialized nation on the face of the earth, the most democratic nation, we would argue, that there is on our globe. But indeed, that's the reality we've been experiencing. So here's what we do to make the changes. We're going to have to shift now to making sure our policies are reflective of civilian policing and not military operations. Civilian policing means that we want people that can negotiate with the civilians and recognize where they are and address the problems they're having. If you've got a problem with the police, you don't send the police in to defend itself. Because quite frankly, that's like me saying, if I have a problem with my income taxes, let me be the judge and jury as to whether I need to pay more. Indeed, what they're saying is if police make a mistake, the police will be the ones that actually make that determination. That has to change. There has to be community policing oversight. That is, the local community should set up police accountability review boards that actually have the power to be able to maintain independence, have separate funding. They need to be able to actually investigate what's going on with the police incident. They should have the power to convene a grand jury if there are criminal activities involved in that police officer's program or behavior, and make sure that they indeed have the power to do everything they need to see if that police officer is behaving themselves or if they were acting accordingly. Again, having the police department investigate itself is unacceptable. I think most thinking people wouldn't buy it, and certainly we don't. So we want to fix that part of it as well. Retraining, accountability. We need programs also in place like the Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act. This is a bill that's been pending before the Congress to actually help put together what a police accountability should look like at the local level, and actually helps the federal government actually coordinate its activities and resources and make sure they're successful. Number two, we are going to have to pass the End Racial Profiling Act. This is a bill that's been pending before the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate for decades now. It's a bill that recognizes that racial profiling happens, that most African Americans, Latinos, and other people of color are outraged when they're pulled over by the police for no good reason. When I say no good reason, there's no APB out on them. There is no other reason to go after that person other than it's determined that the pretextual process or reason for the traffic stop is the color of their skin. Because your skin is black or brown, you're driving through the wrong neighborhood. As such, we don't think there are very many black and brown people living here. So if you're coming through the neighborhood, you must be guilty of something. Either you've committed a crime or you're on your way to commit a crime. Well, what we've done is just created a law enforcement, government-sponsored strategy for segregation. We're going to use now government tax dollars paid through law enforcement to make sure we keep people of color out of neighborhoods that are predominantly black. That is simply unacceptable, but unfortunately, de facto, it happens all too often still in our country. So that has to stop as well. You know, I heard about one case where a young white man came to talk to us because he was racially profiled as well. And as you can imagine, the look on my face is, well, wait a minute now, you are the epitome of those who don't get racially profiled. He said, yeah. He said, but my girlfriend lives on the other side of town, and she happens to be African American. Every Friday night I go to pick up my girlfriend so we can go on a classic date, go out to dinner, and movies, the theater, or whatever the case might be. I regularly get stopped by police and ask them at one point, why are you stopping me? And their response was, well, down in this neighborhood, we're convinced that the only business a white man has here is to buy drugs or a hooker. Well, he said, I'm doing neither, but somehow you're enforcing law with that presumption. That happens to African Americans all the time. If we're going into certain neighborhoods, it's clear in their minds that we're up to no good. But I can tell you as a young African, well, a little older now, but as a young African American man, I used to get stopped all the time going through certain suburbs of St. Louis. I grew up in St. Louis. And the police were taught to watch out for certain things, and the color of my skin was one of them. As a matter of fact, I often got stopped and I would ask them in my best, I don't really date myself, in my best Eddie Haskell voice from Leave It to Beaver, well, officer, sir, what is it that I did wrong? And at the end of the discussion, not in a confrontational way, because my first priority was to get away from these people as fast as I could. But they would always say things like, well, your turn signal stayed on too long. Mm-hmm. Well, you and I both know, when you're driving a car, you flick your turn signal to turn, and once you turn back, it automatically turns itself off. But that was the excuse he gave. One guy said, well, when I pulled you over, I thought your tailpipe and muffler were hanging too low. And I said in my nicest voice, well, do I need to raise it, officer, sir? And he said, no, after closer examination, and let me see on the side of this, after he finished actually searching my car and whatnot, looking for any other contraband he could possibly find, without a search warrant, by the way. But after he finished doing all those things, he said, no, after looking at it, everything is just fine. Those are the kind of excuses that most people can grow weary of very quickly. You know, after this has gone on so long, you know that there's no good reason for them pulling you over. You're not a suspect because you have no record. So why indeed would, if they look up your driver's license or your license plates on your car, if they see no connection between you and any crime that's been committed, why then would they pull you over? But indeed, that's what we experience in America all the time. In this little span of highway that runs between Washington, D.C. and Wilmington, Delaware, Highway 95, as a matter of fact. We did some research a number of years ago and determined that approximately 17% of the driving population along that stretch of highway were African American. Oh, pretty heavily concentrated area, so disproportionately high makes good sense. But when we looked at the number of people that were actually stopped and looked at that also by race and participation, what we determined is approximately 70% of those who were stopped for routine traffic stops were also African American. So indeed, they didn't find that more crimes had been committed, that they sped more often or anything along those lines. But police officers decided that perhaps that hunch of whether somebody was involved in some illicit, illegal activities was going on, but by virtue of the color of one's skin, we're going to have to address those issues in a significant way to prevent the Michael Browns, the Trayvon Martins, the Jordan Davises, the Amadou Diallos, and so many other cases like this from ever happening again.
Going back to the Ferguson incident, the prosecutor, it is said that his father apparently was killed in an incident that also involved an African American. What is your position? Do you think that this prosecutor should stay on the case, or somebody else should be handling it?
Well, somebody else should handle the case. If there's any possibility of impropriety in a case that is as sensitive as this, then indeed we should actually make sure that there's no contradictions or no other problems. No problems, period, as a matter of fact. So having another prosecutor come in just makes good sense. And you're right, in the case of Mr. McCullough, his father was a very well-respected police officer and was actually killed in the line of duty by an African-American assailant. There are many that believe that because of that experience and the number of open cases that are still pending before the St. Louis County Police Departments that include everything from racial profiling to overuse of force and other problems of policing, and of how those have been handled in the past, that it doesn't bring a great deal of integrity to the process by having someone that has a history along those lines. So it'll just be smarter all the way around to assign a special prosecutor and just have them actually prosecute the case through to some conclusion.
Do you think that the trip Eric Holder, the Attorney General, made to Ferguson, did it help at all?
I think it did. As a matter of fact, we saw there was a direct correlation between things cooling down with these extraordinary initiatives by the administration. President Obama deserves an awful lot of credit for how he's handled this. Eric Holder is extremely well respected within the African American community and the legal community all the way around. What you have is the highest ranking law enforcement official in the country. Decided that this case is so important. that he himself would make sure that everything was going well on the ground. See, we knew after conversations with the Justice Department at the NAACP that 2 lawyers had already been sent in from the Civil Rights Division to begin investigating. The Pattern and Practices Unit of the Civil Rights Office has already sent personnel on the ground as well. CRS, another division of the Justice Department, is on the ground. The FBI had been investigating. So we knew that the federal Justice Department was coming in to bring some integrity, quite frankly, to the review process. Again, having the federal government come in to actually oversee what was going on with an investigation of a local police department, rather than having that police department investigate itself, just makes good sense. So I think all the way around, it was good to have Eric Holder's presence on the ground. He's well respected in many of the African American communities. NAACP's actually had him at our national convention on several occasions. He has an incredible track record of fighting for justice that is really second to none, and his understanding of racial disparity issues and what is also extremely important. So it was a smart move, and as you've seen, it helped actually quash the uprising, calm fears that this process would not be done in a just manner, and let us know that those highest ranking officials in our country are actually paying attention to what's going on. It was a good idea.
You mentioned a few steps that need to be taken to prevent the occurrence of such incidents. However, it's going to take time. This is not something that's going to happen overnight. Basically, the culture of the country has to be changed. But in the meantime, till we get there, do you think, given the fact that there have been so many incidents, similar ones, that a possible future one could be even worse than what we witnessed in Ferguson?
It's quite possible, and which is why we must move now. There are plenty of good ideas and programs that are actually pending on the table right now. As I mentioned, there's a bill that's been introduced by Senator Cardin of Maryland and Congressman Conyers of Detroit, Michigan, called the End Racial Profiling Act. This is a bill that will help begin to address those issues of racial profiling right away. There's a bill that passed the House of Representatives that is now pending in the U.S. Senate called the Deaths in Custody Act. This is a bill that actually begins to collect data, which we don't do significantly in our country, of how many people die at the hands of law enforcement at every level, from those that are being approached by law enforcement on the streets like Michael Brown, to those that end up dying in jail cells or even boot camps for kids across the country. That data needs to be collected as well. And then Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act sets up a good infrastructure for how we have citizens' involvement in preventing these kind of things from happening ever again. Local communities, state communities, and the country at the federal level can begin moving to address all of these issues if we just will. And I think what we've seen in Ferguson, if it's any example, and quite frankly, I think it's a good prototype, that once it is seen by the people there, that our law enforcement, our government is serious about addressing their problems and not writing off another African-American young person's death as just collateral damage in the war on crime in America, then things will change significantly. I believe once people realize that we've gotten to the point where America has not declared war on itself, whether it's war on itself as we call it the war on drugs, whether it's war on itself as we call it the war on crime, whatever the case might be, we have to stop this and decide that we are indeed one nation under God, and as such, we have to begin to treat each other as citizens and human beings and really stop this very nasty approach to law enforcement in our country.
Don't you think there's another factor involved here that has caused this culture of militarization, and that is the fact that there's basically weapons in the hands of the regular man on the street?
There's too much of that.
So gun control, don't you think there should be some, that is a factor in itself?
Oh, I do. I believe it's a very, very important component. Listen, this is a comprehensive problem that's going to require a universal response. Within that universal response, it's going to have to be sane, sensible gun safety. You're right. We have more guns in individual hands than we have individual citizens in the United States of America now. We've exceeded over 300 million. I remember when we celebrated that earmark in our population. But I also saw that we noticed over 300 million civilian firearms that are also on the streets of America as well. We've got to be much more sensible about this issue than we have been. A lot of this approach makes no sense whatsoever. In essence, we have too many guns in civilian hands. There's no question. Every time a big incident happens, whether it's Sandy Hook, Columbine, whether it's Aurora, Colorado's movie theater at midnight, whether it's Gabby Gifford being shot to death on the parking lot doing a normal Democratic with a small d rally for a political issue. Those kind of folks, those kind of American activities should never have to contend with gun violence the way that we've had to contend with them. But we can't even pass sane, sensible gun control laws that are now pending in both the House and the Senate. Something as basic as, let's do more extensive background checks. Clearly guns are getting into the wrong hands. Let's see what we can do to try to filter this through and make sure that the wrong people don't get guns. It's sitting behind the desk in the U.S. Senate. Issues like firearm clips, bullet clips, that hold 70 to 120 bullets and whatnot. We know that if whether we're looking at Sandy Hook, the Long Island Railroad, whether we're looking at what happened at Aurora movie theater in Colorado, the only time they were able to apprehend those shooters were when the bullet clips ran out. But sadly, as we look at Aurora as one example, we had 26 people. Each of them got shot at least twice without the shooter having to reload even one time. That's because they're using those long bullet clips. I get this magazine, I won't say the name of the company, some little catalog for outdoorsmen and, hunting and all that stuff. I love their, cargo pants and those kind of things, so I get their catalog. Front page of the catalog was a bullet clip you can buy for an AR-15. Seems to be the assault weapon of choice, the military assault weapon of choice in the United States for these mass killings. Had 2 cylinders, you clip it right in where the little clip normally goes, and it held over 100 bullets. 100 times you could shoot without ever reloading. And again, they weren't able to apprehend these shooters until those clips ran out. Whether it's Colin Ferguson on the Long Island Railroad, whether it was the guy that was shooting at Gabby Gifford, when he went to reload, they got him. When it was the shooter in Aurora, he ran out of bullets during the Batman screening at midnight, and they were able to tackle him then once he ran out. It sounds silly to some until you look at the real details of these cases. But we have to be smarter about guns along those lines. And finally, there's the issue of straw sales. Those people that can go and so easily buy guns legally and then go into communities and just literally sell them out of the trunks of their cars. I mean, we passed a law in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, saying that we want to make sure that in states like Virginia, you could not buy more than 1 gun a month. Now, to rational people, buying 12 guns a year is an awful lot anyway, so what difference does this make? But there were those that fought it. What they didn't take into consideration is that even though it is nearly impossible to legally buy a gun in Washington, D.C., 65% of all the guns picked up for illegal activities here in the streets of the nation's capital were bought legally in Virginia. 45% of the guns bought in the streets of New York are picked up in the streets of New York. Another city and state that is very difficult to actually buy a gun legally. You really have to go through a very strenuous background check, quite frankly, as it should be. But for some entrepreneurs, for some would-be gangbangers, I guess, filling up that duffel bag full of all those guns for the gun dealer they bought them legally from in Virginia, hopping sometimes even on our Amtrak railroad cars and going up to New York and selling those guns that end up being used in so many illegal activities is a great way to make money. But when the bill came up, we were unwilling to do anything about it. So we have some major problems we've got to address, and certainly as we talk about the issues of gun violence and the all too easy access to military-style assault weapons and others, there's much, much more we need to do.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Mr. Shilton.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you. Enjoy the
Certainly.
conversation.
Same here. Thank you.